Sometimes the people we look down on are the very ones who hold the truth we're afraid to face. And sometimes a single act of cruelty opens the door to justice we thought was long buried. In 1887, the wealthy town of Ashford Ridge sent an invitation to Elias Crow, a poor mountain man who lived alone beyond the pines. They didn't invite him out of kindness. They invited him to mock him at their harvest feast. The town expected him to stay away or show up in rags so they could laugh behind their glasses of fine wine. But Elias came. And when he walked through those doors, his quiet presence began to unravel 20 years of buried secrets about stolen land, broken promises, and debts that were never paid. What truth could one silent man possibly carry that an entire town feared? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. Ashford Ridge sat in a valley where the autumn sun turned everything golden. The town had grown prosperous over 20 years, its main street lined with brick buildings that spoke of permanence and wealth. The first bank of Ashford stood 3 stories tall with marble columns. The general store had glass windows imported from St. Louis. Even the saloon had been rebuilt with proper oak and polished brass fixtures that caught the afternoon light. Mayor Thomas Whitmore stood on his office balcony that October morning, surveying the town with satisfaction. At 52, he'd kept his figure trim and his beard neatly trimmed. His suits came from San Francisco, his pocket watch from Switzerland. Everything about him declared success, and he'd worked hard to cultivate that image. Below him, the town square was being transformed for the harvest feast. Tables were carried out from the community hall. Women arranged decorations of dried corn and autumn leaves. Children ran between the workers, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. This would be the finest celebration Ashford Ridge had ever held. In the mayor's office behind him, 2 men waited. Samuel Hartwell, the banker, poured himself whiskey despite the early hour. He was heavy-set now, his face showing the red flush of a man who drank too much and worried constantly. At 49, he looked older than his years. James Cordell stood by the window, lean and sharp-featured. The land speculator dressed well, but not ostentatiously. His eyes were always calculating, always looking for the next opportunity. He was the youngest of the 3 at 46, and the most ruthless. "The invitations went out last week," Whitmore said, stepping back inside. "Everyone who matters will be there." "Including the entertainment?" Cordell asked with a thin smile. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably. "I still think this is cruel, James. The man hasn't done anything to us." "He exists," Cordell said flatly. "Living up there in poverty, a reminder of—" He stopped himself. "Besides, it's harmless fun. If he's smart, he won't come." Whitmore sat behind his desk. "Abraham Fletcher was asking questions again yesterday, about the early days. The old fool's memory is too good." "He's 76, Cordell said. "No one listens to old-timers rambling about ancient history." But Hartwell's hand shook as he lifted his glass. "Maybe we should just leave well enough alone." "It's too late for that," Whitmore said. "The invitations are sent. If we cancel now, people will wonder why." 8 miles away, up a steep mountain trail, Elias Crow stood outside his cabin watching an eagle circle overhead. The bird rode the thermal currents with effortless grace, master of its domain. Elias envied that freedom. His cabin was small but well-maintained. A single room with a stone fireplace, a bed he'd built himself, shelves lined with a few precious books. The clearing around it showed signs of careful work. A vegetable garden now harvested for winter, a smokehouse, a lean-to for firewood stacked with precise attention. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work, even if that work was simply survival. Elias was 58 years old, though his weathered face and calloused hands made him look older. His hair had gone mostly gray, worn long and pulled back. His clothes were patched but clean. His boots, though worn, were well-oiled and cared for. There was dignity in his bearing despite his circumstances. He'd received the invitation 3 days ago, carrying it back from his monthly trip to town for supplies. The cream-colored card with its elegant script sat now on his small table, next to his worn leather journal. He'd read it several times, understanding exactly what it was. An insult dressed up as courtesy. The people of Ashford Ridge called him the poor mountain man. He heard the whispers when he came to town, saw the way they looked at him, or more often, looked away. To them, he was a cautionary tale, a man who'd failed at life and retreated to the wilderness to hide his shame. They didn't know the truth. He preferred it that way. Most days. A knock on his cabin door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Deputy Marcus Webb standing there, hat in hand. The young man was barely 30, new to Ashford Ridge, still idealistic enough to treat everyone with basic respect. "Mr. Crow," Webb said, "hope I'm not disturbing you." "You rode 8 miles up a mountain," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. "Must be important." "May I come in?" Elias stepped aside. Webb entered, looking around the simple cabin with interest rather than pity. That alone set him apart from most townspeople. "Coffee," Elias offered. "Please." They sat across from each other at the small table while coffee heated over the fire. Webb noticed the invitation. "You received one too, then?" "I did." "Are you going?" Elias poured the coffee, handed a cup to Webb. "Why are you here, Deputy?" Webb met his eyes directly. "My father knew you. Before he died last year, he told me some things. Said you were a good man. Said you'd been treated poorly by the town, though he wouldn't say how." Elias said nothing, sipping his coffee. "I've been in Ashford Ridge 6 months now," Webb continued. "I've been learning things about how the town was founded, about certain land transactions, about partnerships that dissolved under questionable circumstances. That's old business. Maybe. But I think there's new business connected to it. Business the people of Ashford Ridge should know about." Elias studied the young deputy. "You're talking in riddles." Webb pulled papers from his jacket. "I found records of a planned sale. The mayor, the banker, and James Cordell are negotiating with the Continental Railroad. They're selling the town, the land, the mineral rights, everything. That's their right. They own it." "Do they?" Webb spread the papers on the table. "I found old partnership documents. 4 names, not 3. 4 men who pooled their money and bought land grants together in 1864. 4 men who founded what became Ashford Ridge." Elias's face remained impassive, but his hand tightened on his coffee cup. Webb continued. "One of those names was Elias Crow. According to these documents, you should own 1/4 of everything they're about to sell, but somehow your name disappeared from the deeds. The partnership dissolved, and you ended up here while they got rich. Like I said, old business. Not if they're about to make millions selling land that partly belongs to you. Not if that sale will displace half the families in town to make way for a railroad depot." Webb leaned forward. "I did the math, Mr. Crow. Your share, calculated fairly, would be worth close to $50,000. The number hung in the air between them. "Why are you telling me this?" Elias finally asked. "Because the sale finalizes in 3 weeks. Because those families don't know they're about to lose their homes. Because the only thing that can stop it legally is if someone with prior claim files an injunction." Webb paused. "Because my father said you were the most honorable man he ever met, and I think this town needs honor right now." Elias stood, walked to the small window. Outside, the eagle was gone, the sky empty. "Your father was a good man," he said quietly. "One of the few who still treated me with respect after—" He stopped. "But honor doesn't win against power and money. I learned that lesson 20 years ago. Maybe things are different now. Maybe they're not." Webb gathered his papers. The invitation to the feast. It's meant to humiliate you. They think you're broken, harmless. They think they can mock you without consequence. They can. Or, Webb stood, you could show them they're wrong. You could walk into that feast with your head high and your proof in hand. You could speak truth in front of the whole town. Elias turned from the window. And then, what? They'd still have lawyers, money, connections. I'd still be a poor mountain man no one believes. Maybe. But you wouldn't be alone. I'd stand with you. And I think others would too once they knew the truth. Webb put on his hat. The feast is in 4 days. Whatever you decide, sir, I respect it. After the deputy left, Elias sat alone in his cabin as afternoon shadows lengthened. He opened his leather journal, turning pages filled with careful notations. Every dollar loaned, every promise made, every betrayal documented with dates and witnesses. He'd kept these records for years, not for revenge, but because documenting the truth had been the only power left to him. The only way to prove to himself that he hadn't imagined what happened, hadn't deserved what they did. He turned to the front of the journal. There, in young handwriting that barely resembled his current script, was the first entry. August 12th, 1864. 4 partners, 4 brothers in all but blood. Today we begin building something that will outlast us all. The irony burned even after all these years. Elias closed the journal and looked at the invitation again. He could stay here in his cabin, safe in his solitude. Let the town have its feast and its laughter. Let them sell to the railroad and displace families who'd done nothing wrong. Or he could do what Deputy Webb suggested. Walk into that feast, speak the truth, risk everything for people who'd never shown him kindness. The eagle returned, landing in a pine tree near the cabin. It sat there, watching him with fierce, intelligent eyes. Sometimes, Elias thought, you had to choose between peace and justice. Sometimes they were the same thing. He began preparing for the journey down the mountain. The week before, the feast passed slowly in the mountains. Elias worked methodically, as he did everything. He cleaned his one good suit, the black wool he'd kept wrapped in oilcloth for years. It still fit, though it hung looser on his frame than it once had. Mountain life had made him lean and hard. He stood before the small mirror he rarely used, examining himself critically. Gray hair, yes, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, but his eyes were still clear, still sharp. And when he stood straight, the posture came back naturally, the bearing of a man who'd once worn a uniform with pride. From the trunk at the foot of his bed, he retrieved items he hadn't looked at in years. A small wooden box contained 3 medals, their ribbons faded but the metal still bright. Congressional Medal of Honor. Silver Star. Purple heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. Beside them lay a daguerreotype in a brass frame, the image slightly faded but still clear. 3 young men in Union Army uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders. They couldn't have been more than 25 years old, faces unlined and full of hope. The one on the left was Thomas Whitmore. The one on the right was Samuel Hartwell. The one in the middle, grinning with his whole face, was Elias himself. James Cordell had taken the photograph. He'd been there too, though he'd refused to stand in it, claiming he looked terrible in photographs. 4 friends. 4 brothers forged in the fire of war. 4 men who'd sworn to build something together when the fighting finally ended. Elias set the photograph down carefully. That version of himself, young, hopeful, believing in the goodness of his friends, seemed like a different person entirely. In some ways, he supposed it was. The war had been brutal. Elias had enlisted in 1861 at 19 years old, full of idealism and certainty about right and wrong. He'd returned in 1865 with those certainties shattered, his body scarred, and a desperate need for something clean and new to believe in. They'd all felt that way. Thomas, Samuel, James, and Elias. They'd survived when so many hadn't. and they'd made promises to each other in field hospitals and around campfires. Promises about the future they'd build together. Go west. Buy land. Create something lasting. Be the brothers to each other that the war had made them. For a while, it had worked. Elias opened his leather journal, turning to those early entries. His handwriting then had been neat and optimistic, full of plans and calculations. August 1864. They'd pooled their money and bought land grants in Colorado Territory. Elias had contributed the most, money from his family back east, plus his military pension, plus savings from before the war. $5,200 of the total $8,000 they needed. He hadn't minded. They were brothers. What was his was theirs. They'd traveled west together, 4 young men with dreams bigger than their resources. They'd worked hard, scouting locations, filing claims, making deals. By spring of 1865, they'd established the beginnings of what would become Ashford Ridge. Then, Elias had made the mistake of re-enlisting for one more tour. His fingers traced the entry from September 1865. Leaving for 6 months, Thomas will manage the partnership while I'm gone. Trust him like I trust myself. He'd come back in April 1866 with shrapnel in his leg and back, injuries that made physical labor difficult. He'd needed time to heal, time to recover. He'd asked for patience, told them he'd contribute again once he was stronger. The vote had come in October 1866, 3-1. The partnership was dissolved for his shares. He was bought out for $2,000. Less than half what he'd invested, and nothing close to what his share was worth by then. They'd been kind about it in their way. Thomas had explained it regretfully. Samuel had avoided his eyes. James had simply said it was business, nothing personal. Elias had taken the money. He'd had no choice, and bought a small cabin up the mountain. He'd written letters for 2 years, asking about the agreement they'd made, reminding them of their promises. The letters had gone unanswered. Eventually, he'd stopped writing. He'd built his life in the mountains, learned to live with less, made peace with solitude, or so he'd told himself. Down in Ashford Ridge, preparations for the feast continued with mounting excitement. Catherine Brennan arranged the final details with her usual efficiency. The widow owned the general store, having taken it over when her husband died 8 years ago. She was 43 years old, with gray threading through her dark hair and a quiet strength that came from surviving hardship. Her daughter Sarah helped with the decorations. At 22, Sarah had her mother's practical nature and her father's gentle heart. She noticed things others missed, including the undercurrent of cruelty in the invitation to the mountain man. "It seems mean-spirited," Sarah said as they hung bunting in the town square. Catherine paused in her work. "It is mean-spirited, but the mayor and his friends have a way of making cruelty seem like harmless fun. You don't like them much, do you?" "I don't trust them much," Catherine corrected. "There's a difference." Across the square, 3 elderly residents sat on a bench in the afternoon sun. Abraham Fletcher, Ruth Morrison, and Daniel Webb, the deputy's late father's brother. They watched the preparations with the particular perspective of those who'd seen the town grow from nothing. "They invited Elias Crow," Ruth said quietly. Abraham nodded slowly. "Heard about that. It's cruel. That young man doesn't deserve it," Ruth continued. "Never did anything but help people when he first came here." Daniel leaned forward on his cane. "He was good to my brother. Lent him money to start his farm, never asked for it back when times got hard. He lent money to half the folks who got started here," Abraham said, "then got pushed out for his trouble." Ruth looked at him sharply. "You remember what happened?" "I remember. I was here. So were you. We should say something. Who'd listen to us? We're just old folks with failing memories." Abraham's voice was bitter. That's what they'd say anyway. In the mayor's office, The three men met again. This time, the mood was less celebratory. "Abraham Fletcher's been talking," Hartwell said without preamble. "Ruth Morrison, too. They're telling people about the old partnership." Whitmore waved this away. "They're old. No one takes them seriously." "Deputy Webb takes them seriously," Cordell said. "He's been asking questions, looking at old land records." This got Whitmore's attention. "What kind of questions?" "The inconvenient kind." Cordell's face was hard. About how 4 partners became 3. About what happened to certain investments and who profited from them. Hartwell poured himself another drink. "Maybe we should just pay Elias. Give him something to keep quiet." "He's had 20 years to make noise," Whitmore said. "He's never done anything but hide up on that mountain. He's harmless." "Then why are you sweating?" Cordell asked bluntly. Whitmore touched his forehead, found it damp. "It's warm in here." "It's October. It's not warm." Cordell stood. "The feast is in 3 days. If Elias comes, we smile and treat him like any other guest. If he causes trouble, we handle it. But we don't show weakness." "And if he brings up the old partnership?" Hartwell's voice shook slightly. "Then we explain that it was dissolved legally, properly, with full compensation. Ancient history." Cordell's eyes were cold. "Besides, who's going to believe a poor mountain man over the mayor, the banker, and the most successful land developer in the territory?" After they left, Whitmore sat alone in his office. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out his own daguerreotype, the same one Elias had. 4 young men who'd been brothers. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the image. "But we'd all built too much to lose by then. You understand, don't you? It was just business." The photograph offered no absolution. Up on the mountain, Elias packed carefully for the journey down. Clean clothes, his suit, the leather journal, the daguerreotype, the original partnership papers, notarized and sealed that he'd kept safe all these years. And one more thing, the deed to his mountain property, signed and witnessed. On the back, in his neat handwriting, was his last will and testament. Everything he owned left to the town of Ashford Ridge for public use. If he was going to risk speaking truth to power, he wanted to make sure his affairs were in order. Deputy Webb arrived on the morning Elias was set to leave. The young man carried a bundle. "My Uncle Daniel wanted you to have this," Webb said, unwrapping a fine wool coat. "Said you lent it to my father once, years back. My father never returned it before he died. Uncle Daniel thought you might need it for the feast." Elias recognized the coat. He'd given it to Webb's father during a particularly hard winter. He'd told him to keep it. "Your father was a good man. He said the same about you. Said you were the reason his farm succeeded." Webb paused. "Said a lot of farms succeeded because of you. That was a long time ago. Good deeds don't expire, Mr. Crow." Webb handed him a folder. "I made copies of everything I found. Partnership documents, land transfers, bank records. You'll want them with you." Elias took the folder. "You're putting yourself at risk, Deputy. Those men have power in this town. My oath is to justice, not to powerful men." Webb smiled slightly. "Besides, my father would haunt me if I stayed silent." They stood in the morning light, 2 men separated by age and experience, but united in purpose. "Whatever happens at that feast," Webb said, "I'll be there. You won't face them alone." After Webb left, Elias took one last look at his cabin. It had been his refuge for 20 years, his sanctuary from a world that had proven cruel and disappointing. Part of him wanted to stay, to let sleeping dogs lie. But another part, the part that had once worn a uniform and believed in honor, that part couldn't let innocent people lose their homes while he remained silent. He locked the cabin door, adjusted the pack on his back, and began the long walk down the mountain. The eagles circled overhead, calling once before disappearing into the vast blue sky. The atmosphere in the town square had transformed completely. What had begun as a celebration had become a trial, with the entire community as unwilling jury. People shifted in their seats, some uncomfortable, others leaning forward with growing interest. The harvest feast spread before them was forgotten. Mayor Whitmore attempted to regain control. He stood, forcing his politician's smile back into place, though it looked increasingly strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is hardly the time or place for airing old grievances. Perhaps Mr. Crow and we could discuss this matter privately." "No." Abraham Fletcher's voice rang out clear despite his 76 years. He stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and all eyes turned to him. "If this is going to be discussed, let it be discussed in front of everyone. We've kept silent too long." "Abraham," Whitmore said, his tone somewhere between warning and plea. "You're confused. The past isn't as clear as you think. My memory is perfectly clear, Thomas." Fletcher's use of the first name carried its own weight. He'd known these men when they were young, had watched them build their fortunes. "I was here at the beginning. I remember exactly what happened." Ruth Morrison stood as well, her aged hands gripping the table for support. "So do I. And it's time the truth was spoken." Cordell's face went hard. "Old folks confuse things. Misremember, you're talking about events from more than 20 years ago. I remember the day you four arrived." Ruth interrupted, her voice sharp. "Summer of 1864, right after the war ended. You rode in together, Thomas, Samuel, James, and Elias. You were all young, all full of dreams." Abraham nodded. "They called themselves brothers, said they were going to build something that would last, something honorable, a town where veterans could find peace and prosperity." A younger man in the crowd, someone who'd arrived in Ashford Ridge only a few years ago, spoke up skeptically. "Even if that's true, it doesn't mean anything now. People form partnerships and dissolve them all the time. That's just business." "It wasn't just business," another voice said. Daniel Webb, the deputy's uncle, stood with difficulty, his joints stiff with age. "It was theft dressed up as business." Deputy Marcus Webb moved to his uncle's side, ready to support him if needed. His presence there, in uniform, gave the old man's words official weight. Daniel continued. "My brother, Marcus's father, was one of the first to borrow money from Elias Crow. $500 to start his farm. Elias lent it without hesitation, without requiring collateral. Just trust between good men." He looked directly at the three men at the head table. "My brother paid it back over 3 years, every penny. But he always said Elias never pressed him, never threatened him when times were hard. That's the kind of man Elias was." "I remember that too," Ruth said. "Half the families that got started here did so with money or help from Elias. He had capital from his war service, from his family back east, and he shared it freely." A woman in her 50s stood up. "My father borrowed from him too. Never charged interest. Just asked that we help others when we could." More voices joined in. Older residents, those who'd been present in the early days, speaking up with memories that painted a picture very different from the one the town had lived with for 20 years. Samuel Hartwell, his face now shining with sweat, stood abruptly. "This is ancient history. What does it matter now? We're talking about transactions from decades ago." "It matters," Elias said quietly. "Because you built your wealth on my investment. Because every building in this town, every business, every parcel of land was purchased initially with capital I provided. Because you promised me partnership and brotherhood, and you gave me betrayal instead." He opened his journal again, turning pages with careful precision. October 1866. Partnership meeting, 3 votes to 1. Motion to dissolve Elias Crow's share due to inability to contribute to daily operations. His voice remained steady, but something raw showed through. "I was recovering from wounds, shrapnel in my leg and back from a battle in Virginia. I'd asked for time to heal. 6 months, maybe a year, I'd still contributed ideas, planning, advice. I just couldn't do physical labor. Catherine Brennan spoke, her voice cutting through the murmurs. They excluded you because you were injured? A war veteran who'd funded their start? That's exactly what they did. Elias looked at her, and she saw the decades of pain in his eyes. They gave me $2,000, less than half my original investment, and told me it was fair compensation. It was what we could afford at the time, Hartwell said desperately. The business was still establishing itself. The business, Elias interrupted, owned 3,000 acres of land at that point, land that's now the foundation of everything you see around you, land worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He turned to a marked page in his journal. Here, documented land purchases from August 1864 through September 1866. Every acre, every transaction, every dollar spent. My contribution, $5,200. Whitmore's contribution, $100. Hartwell's contribution, $900. Cordell's contribution, $800. The numbers were stark, undeniable. I provided 65% of the initial capital, and I was bought out for $2,000. Elias's voice remained calm, but the injustice resonated in every word. Tell me, gentlemen, does that seem like fair compensation? Whitmore's face had gone from pale to flushed. We couldn't have known the land would appreciate so much. But you did know, Deputy Webb said, stepping forward. He pulled papers from his jacket. I've been researching land records. 2 months before you dissolved the partnership, you received a survey report showing likely mineral deposits in the valley. Gold, silver, possibly copper. He held up the documents. You knew the land was worth far more than you'd paid, and you knew Elias, recovering from his injuries, was vulnerable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just business gone wrong, this was deliberate exploitation. Cordell stood angrily. You can't prove intent. I have the survey report, Webb continued. I have the partnership dissolution documents, and I have correspondence between the three of you discussing how to handle the Crow situation. He looked at them coldly. Intent is very clear. The crowd's mood shifted palpably. What had begun as discomfort and confusion was turning into anger. These men they'd respected, the founders of their town, were being revealed as thieves and betrayers. A merchant called out, "If this is true, why didn't anyone do anything?" Abraham Fletcher answered, his voice heavy with regret. Because we were all beholden to them. They controlled the land, the bank, the opportunities. We needed their goodwill to survive. Speaking up meant risking everything. So we stayed silent, Ruth added, tears in her eyes. We watched Elias retreat to the mountains, watched him become a joke, watched him bear the shame of poverty that should never have been his. And we said nothing. She turned to Elias, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. We should have spoken up years ago. Elias looked at her with something like tenderness. You had families to protect, Ruth, livelihoods to maintain. I understood then, and I understand now. Sarah Brennan, who'd been listening with growing distress, spoke up. Mr. Crow, you have proof of all this. Why didn't you force them to honor the partnership legally? I tried, Elias said simply. For 5 years after they dissolved the partnership, I tried. I went to lawyers in Denver. I filed claims, but I was a poor veteran with injuries, and they were successful businessmen with connections and resources. He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. The legal system favors those with power and money. I had neither. So eventually I stopped fighting. I went to the mountains. I built a life that didn't depend on their honesty or anyone's justice. But you kept the records, Catherine observed. I kept the records. Elias placed his hand on the journal. Not for revenge, not even for restitution after a while. I kept them because documenting the truth was the only power I had left. Because someday I thought the truth might matter. He looked at Whitmore, Hartwell, and Cordell. That day is today. The three men sat frozen, exposed before the entire town. The respect they'd cultivated for decades was crumbling. The authority they'd wielded with such confidence was evaporating, and the poor mountain man they'd invited to mock had become their judge. The mayor attempted one more time to redirect the conversation. He stood, his hands raised in a placating gesture that looked desperate rather than authoritative. "Please, everyone, let's not turn a festive occasion into a courtroom. These are complex matters from long ago." "No," Elias said, his quiet voice somehow carrying more authority than Whitmore's louder plea. "These are simple matters. 4 men made promises to each other. 3 men broke those promises. That's not complex. That's straightforward betrayal." He stood slowly, and the gathering fell silent again. There was something commanding about him now, something that made people understand he had been an officer once, had led men in battle, had carried responsibility and honor. "I came back from my second tour in April 1866, Elias continued. "I'd re-enlisted because we needed the money. The partnership was still establishing itself, and I wanted to contribute. I came back with shrapnel wounds that made physical labor difficult. Not impossible, just difficult." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his lower back, where old wounds still ached on cold mornings. "I asked for time to heal. 6 months, perhaps a year. I told Thomas, Samuel, and James that I'd still contribute however I could. Planning, accounting, negotiations. Just not the heavy physical work of building." Samuel Hartwell spoke, his voice thick with wine and emotion. "You left us alone to do all the work." "I was recovering from war wounds," Elias interrupted, steel in his voice now. "Wounds I received serving this country. Serving alongside you, Samuel. Or have you forgotten that?" Hartwell flinched as if struck. "We carried you out of Petersburg after the explosion," Elias continued, looking directly at Hartwell. "You were unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. Thomas, James, and I took turns carrying you 3 miles to the field hospital." He turned to Whitmore. "I covered for you when you froze during the charge at Cold Harbor. Told the captain you were following my orders when you couldn't move for fear." Then to Cordell. "I gave you my rations for a week when you had dysentery and couldn't keep anything down. Nearly starved myself doing it." Each revelation landed like a blow. The 3 men at the head table looked smaller somehow, diminished by these memories of debts they'd forgotten or chosen to ignore. "We were brothers," Elias said, and for the first time, his voice shook slightly. "Not by blood, but by bonds forged in fire and suffering. We made promises to each other. We swore we'd take care of each other when the war was over." He looked around at the gathered townspeople. "And when I needed them to keep those promises, when I was injured and vulnerable, they voted me out, 3-1, gave me a fraction of what I was owed and sent me away." Catherine Brennan wiped tears from her eyes. She wasn't alone. Many in the crowd were visibly moved by the depth of the betrayal being revealed. Deputy Webb stepped forward with another document. "There's more. After the partnership was dissolved, Mr. Crow didn't just accept it. He fought back through legal channels." He unfolded a letter, yellowed with age. "This is from a lawyer in Denver, dated March 1867. It reads, 'Dear Mr. Crow, after careful review, I must decline to represent you in your claim against the Ashford Ridge Trading Company. While your documentation appears sound, I cannot in good conscience pursue a case against such well-connected individuals without substantial retainer, which I understand you cannot provide.'" Webb pulled out another letter. "May 1867, different lawyer. Mr. Crow, I regret to inform you that after consulting with colleagues, the consensus is that your case, while potentially valid, would be prohibitively expensive to pursue and unlikely to succeed, given the defendant's resources and standing in the community." He produced several more letters, each one a variation on the same theme. Lawyers acknowledging the validity of Elias's claim but refusing to help because he lacked money and power. "For 5 years," Webb said, Mr. Crow tried to get legal representation. He wrote to lawyers across 3 territories. Every one of them turned him away, not because his case lacked merit, but because he lacked resources to fight men with money and influence. The crowd was silent, absorbing this. The system they'd believed in, the law, justice, fairness, had failed a war veteran because he'd been betrayed by wealthy men. Ruth Morrison spoke again, her voice trembling. I remember those years. I saw Elias in town, looking thinner each time, more worn down. He'd spend his last coins on supplies, then walk 8 miles back up that mountain. Some of us tried to help, Abraham Fletcher added. Offered him credit at our stores. He always refused. Said he wouldn't take charity. Because charity from people they controlled would have been another form of dependence, Elias said quietly. I'd learned that lesson. I'd learned that in this town, built on my money, I had no power except the power to remove myself from their reach. He looked at the mountains visible in the distance, touched by the setting sun's golden light. So I went up there, built a cabin, learned to live on what the land provided, found a different kind of wealth, the wealth of self-sufficiency and freedom from men who'd proven themselves untrustworthy. James Cordell, who'd been silent for a while, suddenly spoke with barely contained anger. You could have left the territory entirely, started fresh somewhere else, but you stayed here, a constant reminder, a conscience, Elias suggested. Yes, I suppose I was. Every time you saw me in town, every time I walked past your bank, Samuel, or your office, Thomas, or past your properties, James. You remembered what you'd done. I was living proof of your betrayal. That's why you sent the invitation, isn't it? Catherine said, understanding dawning. You thought if you could make him look pathetic in front of everyone, you could finally silence that conscience. Whitmore didn't answer, but his expression confirmed it. Sarah stood beside her mother, but it didn't work. Because he's not pathetic. He's the most dignified person here. Several people murmured agreement. The poor mountain man, the joke they'd tolerated, had been revealed as something entirely different, a man of principle who'd chosen poverty over compromise, exile over complicity. You asked why I came tonight, Elias said, looking at Whitmore. The truth is, I came because Deputy Webb told me something that changed everything, something that made me realize I couldn't stay silent anymore. He nodded to Webb, who pulled out one more document. 3 weeks ago, Webb said, I discovered that Mayor Whitmore, Samuel Hartwell, and James Cordell have been in secret negotiations with the Continental Railroad Company. The crowd stirred, confused about why this mattered. They're selling Ashford Ridge, Webb continued, all of it. The land, the mineral rights, everything. The railroad wants to build a major depot here, a switching station. It's worth millions to them. Gasps and exclamations erupted from the crowd. The sale is set to finalize in 2 weeks, Webb said over the noise. And when it does, most of you will lose your homes and businesses. You'll be offered pennies on the dollar for property you've spent years building. The railroad will tear down half the town and rebuild it for their purposes. The harvest feast erupted into chaos. People were standing, shouting questions, demanding explanations. The 3 men at the head table were suddenly under siege from every direction, and Elias Crow stood at the center of it all, the bearer of truths that would change everything. The chaos lasted several minutes before Mayor Whitmore's voice cut through, sharp with desperation. That's enough. Everyone calm down. But no one was listening to him anymore. Merchants were demanding to know about their properties. Families were asking about their homes. The elderly residents who'd spent decades here were shouting about graves and memories that couldn't be displaced. Deputy Webb raised his hand, and gradually the crowd quieted enough to hear him. I have documentation, contracts, correspondence with railroad executives, projected timelines. This is real, and it's happening soon. He held up a telegram. This is from the Continental Railroad office in Denver, dated 2 weeks ago. It confirms the purchase price and the construction plans. Mayor Whitmore, Mr. Hartwell, and Mr. Cordell will receive approximately $3 million for the sale. The number was staggering. $3 million, split 3 ways. A fortune beyond anything most of these people could imagine. "And what about us?" someone shouted. "What happens to our homes?" "The railroad has made provision for buyouts," Webb said, reading from another document. "Current property owners will be offered fair market value, as determined by railroad assessors." "Fair market value determined by them," Catherine said bitterly, "which means whatever they decide to pay." Cordell stood, his face hard. "This is progress. The railroad brings jobs, opportunity, growth. For you," a merchant cut him off, "you 3 will walk away with millions while we're displaced." "My family built our store 30 years ago," another voice called out, "before this town even had a name, and you're going to let the railroad tear it down." Ruth Morrison's voice, frail but carrying, spoke over the others. "Our cemetery is on land included in the sale. Where will our dead go?" That silenced the crowd more effectively than anything else. The weight of it, not just homes and businesses, but the graves of loved ones, the physical connection to their history, settled over everyone. Samuel Hartwell, drunk and guilt-ridden, suddenly burst out, "We didn't have a choice. The town was stagnating. Revenue was down. Mines were playing out." "Shut up, Samuel," Cordell hissed. But Hartwell couldn't stop. "We needed capital for improvements. The railroad offered a solution. They said everyone would benefit." "Everyone but the people who live here," Elias said quietly, and the crowd fell silent again to hear him. "Tell them the rest, Samuel. Tell them what the railroad really plans." Hartwell looked at Elias, then at Whitmore and Cordell, then back at the gathered townspeople. His face crumpled. "Half the current buildings will be demolished. The residential areas will be relocated 3 miles south. The railroad will own everything from the creek to the eastern ridge." "That's the entire valley," Abraham Fletcher said, stunned. "That's the whole town." "There will be a new town," Whitmore said, "trying to salvage something. Modern, planned, better than what we have now. Built by the railroad, owned by the railroad, controlled by the railroad." Catherine finished. "You're not improving Ashford Ridge. You're erasing it." Sarah looked at the 3 men with undisguised contempt. "You did it to Mr. Crow 20 years ago, and now you're doing it to all of us. Taking what others built and claiming it as your own." The parallel was clear to everyone. The pattern of betrayal wasn't isolated. It was their method, refined over decades. Deputy Webb pulled out another sheaf of papers. "There's more. I've been reviewing bank records, Mr. Hartwell, with authorization from the Territorial Banking Commission." Hartwell's face went white. "Over the past 15 years, there have been 43 property foreclosures. In each case, the property owner had taken loans from First Bank of Ashford. In each case, Mr. Cordell purchased the property at auction, paying significantly less than its value." Webb looked at Cordell. "And in several cases, the foreclosures occurred after sudden changes in loan terms or unexpected calling of notes." "That's a serious accusation," Cordell said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "It's predatory lending," Webb replied, "and possibly fraud. I've documented cases where families were deliberately pushed into default so their property could be acquired cheaply." An older man stood up, his hands shaking. "You did it to my brother, gave him a loan for his farm, then called the note early when you knew he couldn't pay. His land adjoined the railroad right-of-way you'd been planning even then." Others began speaking up, recognizing similar patterns in their own experiences or those of people they knew. The web of corruption was larger and more systematic than anyone had realized. Elias watched this unfold with an expression of profound sadness. "This is why I had to speak up. Not for myself. For all of you." Catherine turned to him. "What do you mean?" "Deputy Webb came to me 3 weeks ago," Elias explained. He'd discovered the railroad sale and realized what it meant for the town. He also realized that the only thing that could stop it legally was if someone filed a prior claim to the land. Understanding began to dawn on faces throughout the crowd. My original partnership agreement predates all the current property deeds, Elias continued. If I file a legal challenge based on my partnership share, it freezes any sale until the courts resolve the ownership dispute. That could take years, Sarah said. Exactly. And the railroad won't wait years. They'll move their depot plans to another location rather than tie up that kind of capital in legal battles. Deputy Webb nodded. I've already been in contact with a territorial judge. He's reviewed the partnership documents and believes Mr. Crow has a valid claim. If filed tomorrow, we could have an emergency injunction by next week. The crowd was silent, absorbing this. The poor mountain man they'd pitied or ignored, the man they'd invited tonight to mock, held the legal power to save their town. James Cordell's laugh was bitter and harsh. So this is your revenge. Not just exposing us, but destroying the biggest deal we've ever made. This isn't revenge, Elias said, his voice firm. Revenge would have been letting you complete the sale, then filing my claim. Watching you lose everything to legal battles and the railroad's anger. Watching you explain to furious investors why the deal fell through. He looked around at the townspeople. This is justice, giving everyone a chance to keep their homes, giving this community a chance to decide its own future. But it costs you, Catherine said softly. Fighting this in court. It means coming down from your mountain, hiring lawyers, spending months or years in legal battles. I know. Elias's expression was weary. I'd made peace with my solitude. I'd accepted what happened to me. Coming back into this world, fighting these men in court, it's the last thing I wanted. Then why? Someone asked. Elias looked at the faces surrounding him. Families who'd built lives here. Children who'd been born in this valley. Old-timers who'd spent their best years turning wilderness into community. Because I couldn't have peace knowing I'd let good people lose their homes without speaking up. Because staying silent when you have the power to help is just another form of betrayal. He paused. Because I know what it's like to be powerless against men who take without conscience, and I won't let it happen to you if I can prevent it. The crowd erupted into applause, scattered at first, then building. People were standing, some crying, many calling out thanks. The harvest feast had become something else entirely, a moment of community standing together against those who'd betrayed them. Mayor Whitmore slumped in his chair, suddenly looking very old. The confidence and authority he'd worn, like armor, had been stripped away, leaving only a tired man facing the consequences of his choices. Samuel Hartwell was weeping openly now, his face in his hands. I'm sorry, he said, though whether to Elias or the crowd or himself wasn't clear. God help me, I'm sorry. James Cordell remained defiant, but his eyes were calculating, already looking for angles and escapes. He was a survivor, and survivors adapted. Sarah Brennan stepped forward, her young voice clear and certain. Mr. Crow, what do you need from us? How can we help? Elias looked at her, and something in his expression softened. I need witnesses, people who remember the old days, who can testify about the original partnership and what was promised. I'll testify, Abraham Fletcher said immediately. I remember everything. So will I, Ruth Morrison added. And I, Daniel Webb confirmed. More voices joined in, people offering to testify, to search for old documents, to support the legal fight however they could. Catherine stepped forward. I have business records going back 15 years. They might show patterns of land transactions that support your case. I've been documenting everything, Deputy Webb said. Bank records, deed transfers, correspondence, it's all available for the legal challenge. Elias looked around at all these people who an hour ago had seen him as a joke or a cautionary tale, now offering to stand with him. His eyes were bright with emotion he didn't try to hide. 23 years ago, he said quietly, I was powerless. I had truth but no one to listen. Tonight I have truth and all of you willing to hear it." He straightened, his voice gaining strength. "The question now is, what do we do with that truth?" Catherine's voice rang out clearly. "We fight. Together. We save our town." The agreement that followed was immediate and overwhelming. This wasn't just about Elias's stolen partnership anymore. This was about a community choosing to defend itself against those who'd exploit it. And at the center of it all stood a man they'd called poor, revealed now as the richest among them in the ways that truly mattered. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was chaos of a different kind, purposeful, energized chaos. People were no longer sitting passively at the feast tables. They were on their feet, organizing, planning, finding their collective voice. Mayor Whitmore made one last attempt to control the situation. He stood, his voice strained. "Please, everyone, you're reacting emotionally. This isn't as simple as Mr. Crow makes it sound. There are complex legal and financial considerations, like how you were going to make millions while we lost everything," a merchant interrupted. "Those kinds of considerations? The railroad deal would bring prosperity to the region." "To you three," another voice called out. "The rest of us would be scattered, displaced, our lives' work torn down for a train depot." Whitmore looked around for support and found none. Even those who'd benefited from his administration over the years were looking at him with suspicion and anger now. The foundation of respect and authority he'd built had crumbled in a single evening. James Cordell saw this more clearly than Whitmore did. He was a businessman above all else, and he knew when a deal had turned bad. He stood, his voice calm and calculating. "Elias, perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can reach an accommodation that satisfies everyone." "An accommodation?" Catherine Brennan's voice was sharp. "You mean a bribe?" Cordell's jaw tightened. "I mean a practical solution. Mr. Crow wants compensation for his original partnership share. That can be arranged. He wants the railroad sale stopped. Perhaps we can—" "There's no perhaps," Deputy Webb interrupted. "The partnership claim is valid. Once it's filed, the sale cannot proceed until it's resolved. That's not negotiable." "Everything is negotiable," Cordell insisted. "Elias, listen to reason. You want your money back? Fine, we'll pay it. $50,000, more than you're owed. Cash, tomorrow." The offer hung in the air. $50,000, a fortune that would make Elias wealthy beyond anything he'd known. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Some seemed to think he should take it, but Elias shook his head slowly. "And the town sale?" "That's separate business," Cordell said smoothly. "Not your concern." "Not my concern." Elias looked around at the gathered faces. "These people's homes aren't my concern. Their livelihoods aren't my concern." "You came here for justice for yourself," Cordell pressed. "Take it. Walk away with your compensation. Let the rest of us handle our own affairs." It was a clever strategy, trying to separate Elias from the community, to make this about his personal grievance rather than their collective defense. Some in the crowd seemed uncertain now, wondering if they were asking too much of a man who owed them nothing. Ruth Morrison's voice cut through the uncertainty. "Shame on you, James Cordell. You robbed this man once, and now you're trying to do it again by making him choose between his own justice and ours." Abraham Fletcher stood beside her. "Elias Crow has more honor in his little finger than the three of you combined. He's already shown that by coming here tonight instead of taking revenge." "Revenge?" Hartwell's voice was thick with drink and emotion. "What revenge could he have taken?" Deputy Webb answered, "He could have let the sale go through. Filed his partnership claim the day after you received your money from the railroad. The legal battle would have tied up everything. The railroad would have sued you for misrepresentation. Your investors would have turned on you. You'd have lost not just the $3 million, but everything you have." The implications settled over the crowd. Elias could have destroyed them completely, legally, justifiably. Instead, he'd come to warn everyone, to give the community a chance to defend itself. Sarah Brennan stepped closer to Elias. "You didn't come here for yourself at all, did you? You came for us." Elias met her eyes. "I came because Deputy Webb showed me that history was repeating itself. That you three were doing to this whole town what you did to me 20 years ago. I couldn't stay silent and live with myself." "But you could have just filed the injunction," Sarah pressed. "You didn't need to come here tonight. You didn't need to expose yourself to all this." "Yes, I did." Elias looked around at the townspeople. "I needed to see if the truth still mattered here, if honor and justice meant anything to this community. I needed to know if this town was worth saving." The question hung in the air, not whether the town deserved saving, but whether its people would stand up to save it. Catherine spoke first. "It's worth saving, and we'll fight for it. All of us." Agreement rippled through the crowd, building into a chorus of commitment. People were already planning, who had relevant documents, who remembered crucial details, who could contribute to legal fees, who could house Elias during the court proceedings so he wouldn't have to make the mountain journey constantly. The community was organizing itself, finding its strength. Mayor Whitmore watched this with growing desperation. His town, the town he'd led for 15 years, the town that had respected and followed him, was slipping away. And it wasn't just his authority that was crumbling. It was his legacy, his self-image, the story he'd told himself about who he was and what he'd built. "Thomas." Elias's quiet voice somehow reached him through the noise. "This doesn't have to be the end for you." Whitmore looked at him, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "Cancel the sale," Elias continued. "Restore the partnership honestly. Make amends for what was done. You can't undo the past 20 years, but you can choose differently going forward." For a moment, Whitmore seemed to consider it. But then Cordell spoke sharply. "Don't be a fool, Thomas. We're in too deep. We have contracts with the railroad, investors who'll sue us into oblivion if this partnership claim proves valid," Hartwell interrupted. His hands were shaking, but his voice had gained a strange clarity that comes from hitting bottom. "James, it's over. Can't you see that?" "Nothing's over until the courts say it is," Cordell shot back. "We have lawyers, resources." "We have guilt," Hartwell said flatly. "We have 20 years of guilt and a mountain of evidence against us. We stole from our brother. We stole from this town, and now it's time to pay for it." The admission from Hartwell seemed to break something in the gathering. The anger shifted, became less sharp, more sorrowful. This wasn't just about stopping bad men. It was about watching men they'd known for years, men who'd done good things alongside the bad, face the consequences of their choices. Deputy Webb pulled out the final document he'd been holding. "There's one more thing everyone should know. I found the original town charter from 1865. He unfolded the yellowed paper carefully. "It establishes 4 founders, Thomas Whitmore, Samuel Hartwell, James Cordell, and Elias Crow. All 4 are listed as co-equal partners in the town's establishment and future governance." He looked up at the crowd. "This document was filed with the territorial government, its official record. According to this charter, any major decision about the town's future requires approval from all 4 founding partners." "That means," Catherine said slowly, "even if they'd succeeded in pushing through the railroad sale, it would have been invalid. Elias's consent was legally required." "Which they knew," Webb confirmed. "That's why they tried to keep the sale secret until it was finalized. They were hoping to present it as a done deal before anyone could object." The depths of the deception were becoming clearer. This wasn't just a bad business decision. It was systematic fraud, planned and executed with full knowledge of its illegality. An older woman, someone who'd lost her husband years before and raised 3 children alone in Ashford Ridge, spoke up. Her voice trembled but held firm. "Mr. Crow, my husband borrowed money from you in 1865 to start our farm. You told him to pay it back when he could. No interest. He died before he could repay it all." She paused, tears in her eyes. "I still owe you $300. But because of that loan, my children had a home. They grew up here, made their lives here. If the railroad had come, we'd have lost everything." She walked up to Elias, pulled a small purse from her pocket. "This is $40. It's all I can spare right now, but I want you to have it, toward what my husband owed." "No." Elias gently pushed her hand back. "Your husband paid me back long ago in friendship and honesty. You owe me nothing." "Then take it for the legal fight," she insisted. "To save our town." Others came forward then, one by one. Small amounts of money, offers of labor, promises of support. The people of Ashford Ridge, many of them struggling themselves, offering what they could to help the man who'd helped them long ago. Elias stood there, overwhelmed, as the community he'd been exiled from welcomed him back, not with pity, but with respect, with partnership. Catherine organized the contributions. Sarah wrote down offers of assistance. Deputy Webb documented everything for the legal case. Abraham, Ruth, and Daniel gathered the elderly residents to coordinate their testimonies. In less than an hour, the harvest feast had transformed into something unprecedented, a community organizing its own defense, led by the man they'd once rejected. And at the head table, 3 men sat isolated, watching their carefully constructed world collapse around them. They'd thought they controlled Ashford Ridge. They'd thought power and money made them untouchable. They'd forgotten that towns aren't built on money alone. They're built on trust, community, and the willingness of ordinary people to stand together when it matters. Elias had understood that all along. It was why he'd survived 20 years of exile with his dignity intact. And it was why, tonight, he'd won without raising his voice or making threats. The truth, supported by a community willing to hear it, was more powerful than any amount of money or influence. The feast was ending. But for Ashford Ridge, something new was beginning. The signing of the partnership agreement triggered something in the crowd, a release of tension that had been building all evening. Applause began, scattered at first, then building into a sustained ovation. People weren't applauding the 3 men who'd finally done the right thing. They were applauding Elias, and they were applauding themselves for standing together. Catherine stepped forward and embraced Elias briefly. He stiffened at first, unused to such gestures, then relaxed slightly. "Thank you," she said simply, "from all of us." Sarah brought him a plate of food, the feast he'd barely touched during the evening's revelations. "You should eat, Mr. Crow. You've earned it." He accepted with a slight smile. As he ate, people approached in a steady stream. Some thanked him. Others apologized for years of dismissive treatment. A few of the elderly residents simply clasped his hand, tears in their eyes, grateful that old wrongs were finally being addressed. Deputy Webb stood beside Elias, organizing the offers of help that kept coming. "We'll need to file the official documents in Denver. I can accompany you, make sure everything's done properly." "I appreciate that, Deputy. You can stay with my uncle and me while the legal matters are settled," Webb continued. "No need to make the mountain journey constantly." Elias looked toward the mountains, barely visible now in the gathering darkness. "That's generous, but I should return home soon. My life is up there." "Your life can be here too," Catherine said. "You're a founding partner of this town again. You have every right to be part of the community." "Rights and desires aren't always the same thing, Mrs. Brennan." She studied him carefully. "You're planning to go back to the mountain, aren't you? Even with everything that's happened?" "Eventually, yes." "But why?" Sarah asked. "You've been vindicated, respected. You have friends here now, people who want to know you." Elias set down his plate. 20 years ago, I went to the mountains because I had no choice. I was powerless here, unable to get justice, unwelcome in the town I'd helped build. The mountains were exile, but they were also freedom." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Over time, that exile became something else. I learned to live simply, to find satisfaction in small things, to be sufficient unto myself without needing validation from others. You built a good life, Abraham Fletcher said, understanding in his voice. I did. A quiet life, an honest life. One where I didn't have to compromise or navigate the politics of men who'd proven themselves untrustworthy. Elias looked around at the gathering. Tonight was necessary. This fight was necessary, but when it's over, I'll return to the life I've built. You'd give up your partnership share? Your wealth? Someone asked, confused. I'll accept what's owed, but I'll put it in trust for the town's benefit. Schools, a hospital, whatever's needed. Elias's voice was firm. I don't need wealth. I never did. What I needed was the truth to be known and for good people not to lose what they'd built. Catherine smiled, though her eyes were bright with emotion. Most men would take the money and run. Most men didn't spend 20 years learning what truly matters. The celebration continued, but with a different tone now. People were making plans for the legal proceedings, for documenting their histories with the town, for organizing a proper community governance structure that would prevent such concentrated power in the future. Mayor Whitmore, former mayor now, sat apart from the festivities, watching. Samuel Hartwell had left, presumably to go home and face his wife and his conscience. James Cordell remained at the table, drinking steadily, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. Deputy Webb approached Whitmore. What will you do now? I don't know, Whitmore admitted. I've been mayor for 15 years. It's all I know. You could rebuild, Webb suggested. Not your position, but your reputation. There's work to be done making amends to the people you've wronged. Would they accept that? Accept me? Webb looked at the crowd. Some will, some won't. But that's not really the question. The question is whether you can accept yourself while doing the work of making things right. Whitmore nodded slowly. That's the harder part, isn't it? Usually is. As the evening wore on and the celebration gradually wound down, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the town square with Catherine, Sarah, and Deputy Webb. The four of them looked out at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. When will you go? Sarah asked. Tomorrow, probably, once the immediate legal documents are filed. And you'll come back for the court proceedings? When necessary. Deputy Webb knows how to reach me. Catherine turned to face him directly. Elias, I hope you know you're welcome here any time. Not as obligation or charity, but as a valued member of this community. I do know that now. It means more than you realize. Will we see you again, outside of legal matters? He considered this. Perhaps. The mountains are good for solitude, but complete isolation can be its own kind of prison. Maybe I've learned that tonight. Sarah smiled. Then we'll see you for next year's harvest feast. A real invitation this time. I'd like that. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, these people who'd become unlikely allies in a single, extraordinary evening. You know what the remarkable thing is, Catherine said. You could have let bitterness consume you, 20 years of injustice, of watching them prosper while you struggled, but you didn't become bitter, you became wise. Wisdom, Elias said quietly, is just another word for learning from suffering. I had plenty of suffering to learn from. And now? Webb asked. What have you learned? Elias looked at the mountains, then back at the town. That justice delayed isn't always justice denied. That truth has its own timeline, and that sometimes the poorest man in material terms can be the richest in the things that actually matter. He smiled slightly. They called me the poor mountain man. Maybe I was. Maybe I still am. But tonight, I think I proved that poverty and powerlessness aren't the same thing. You did more than prove it, Sarah said. You taught us all something about dignity and honor. As the last of the townspeople headed home, Elias prepared for his final night before returning to the mountains. He'd come down to speak truth and found more than vindication. He'd found a community that had learned to value what truly mattered, and that, he reflected, was worth far more than any fortune. The morning after the harvest feast arrived with golden light and crisp air that promised autumn's steady march toward winter. Elias stood in the town square as the sun rose, his pack ready for the journey back up the mountain. The tables from last night's feast had been cleared away, but the town felt different somehow, changed in ways that couldn't be seen, but could certainly be felt. Deputy Webb arrived with his horse, prepared to ride with Elias part of the way up the trail. They'd spend the morning filing the official legal documents, ensuring everything was properly recorded and witnessed. The judge sent word, Webb said. He's reviewed all the documentation. He's prepared to issue the injunction blocking any land sales pending resolution of the partnership dispute. How long will the legal process take? 6 months, maybe a year, but it's a formality at this point. With Whitmore and Hartwell's cooperation, the courts will simply restore your partnership share and calculate what's owed for the past 23 years. Elias nodded. And the railroad? Already moved on to another location. They don't wait around for legal complications. Ashford Ridge is safe. As they walked toward the territorial office to file the papers, people emerged to greet Elias. Catherine came from her store with a bundle of supplies: coffee, flour, salt, other necessities. "For the mountain," she said. "Winter's coming. You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I want to." She smiled. "Besides, you're a partner in this town again. Consider it part of the profit distribution." Sarah appeared with a stack of books wrapped in oilcloth. "You mentioned you like to read. These are from our personal collection. Mother insists you keep them as long as you like." Elias accepted the gifts, moved by the gestures. These people who'd ignored or pitied him for years were now treating him with genuine warmth and respect. Abraham Fletcher, Ruth Morrison, and Daniel Webb arrived together, moving slowly but deliberately. Abraham carried a small wooden box. "We wanted to give you this before you left," Abraham said, opening the box. Inside was a medal, not military, but civic. "We had it made years ago, when the town was first established. It was supposed to go to the 4 founders, but only 3 were given out." He held it up. It read, "Founder, Ashford Ridge, 1864. For service and sacrifice." "You deserve to have this," Ruth said. "You always did." Elias took the medal, his hands unsteady. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Daniel replied. "Just know that some of us never forgot. Some of us always knew the truth." They pinned the medal to his jacket, and for a moment Elias stood there, a man who'd been cast out and forgotten, now formally recognized for what he'd always been. A founder, a contributor, someone who'd helped build something lasting. The legal filing took less than an hour. The documents were official, notarized, recorded in the territorial registry. The partnership was restored. The injunction against the railroad sale was issued. Ashford Ridge would remain Ashford Ridge, owned and governed by its people. As Elias prepared to leave town, Mayor Whitmore appeared. Former mayor, he corrected himself, looking haggard but somehow more honest than he had in years. The facade was gone, replaced by raw humanity. "Elias," he said simply, "may I speak with you?" They walked to the edge of town, away from curious ears. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Whitmore began. "What we did, what I did, was unforgivable. We were brothers, and I betrayed that." "You did." "I tell myself I had reasons. The business needed capital. You were injured, unable to contribute the way we needed. James was persuasive, and Samuel went along." Whitmore shook his head. "But those are excuses. The truth is simpler and uglier. We wanted what you had, and we took it because we could." Elias listened without responding. "I've watched you for 20 years. Whitmore continued. Seen you in town occasionally, always quiet, always dignified despite your poverty. Every time I felt a stab of guilt, but I buried it. Told myself you'd moved on, that it was ancient history. He looked at Elias directly. Last night when you walked into that feast, I was terrified. Not of what you might say, but of finally having to face what I'd done, having to see myself clearly. And what do you see now? Elias asked. A man who built success on betrayal, a man who let ambition destroy brotherhood, a man who needs to spend whatever time he has left making amends. They stood in silence for a moment. I don't expect forgiveness, Whitmore said, but I want you to know I am truly, deeply sorry for what I did, for what I failed to be. Elias studied his former friend's face. He saw genuine remorse there, mixed with shame and regret. This was no longer the confident politician or successful businessman. This was a broken man, confronting his failures. I forgive you, Thomas, Elias said quietly. Whitmore looked stunned. How? After everything? Because carrying hatred for 20 years taught me that bitterness only imprisons the one who holds it. Elias paused. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You'll still have to live with what you did, still have to earn back trust from this community. That's your burden to carry. I know, and I will carry it. I'll work to make things right. Then we both move forward. Elias extended his hand. Whitmore took it, and they shook, not as the brothers they'd once been, but as two men who'd faced truth together and survived it. As Elias finally left town, walking the familiar trail toward the mountains, Deputy Webb rode alongside him for the first few miles. What will you do up there? Webb asked. In your cabin. What I've always done. Live simply. Watch the seasons change. Find peace in routine and solitude. But you're not the same man who came down 3 days ago. Elias smiled slightly. No, I suppose I'm not. That man was at peace with injustice because fighting it seemed hopeless. This man knows that truth still matters, that community still has power, that one person speaking up can change things. Will you come back? To town, I mean. Not just for legal matters. Elias looked back at Ashford Ridge, spread out, in the valley below. Smoke rose from chimneys. People moved through streets going about their lives. His town, the town he'd helped build and had been cast out from and had now saved. Yes, he said, I think I will. Not to live there. The mountains suit me. But to visit, to be part of the community again, to remember that isolation and independence aren't the same thing. They reached the point where Webb would turn back. The deputy extended his hand. It's been an honor, Mr. Crow. Just Elias, and the honor is mutual. Webb rode back toward town, and Elias continued up the mountain trail alone. The path was familiar, each rock and turn known to him. But he walked it differently now, not as an exile retreating from the world, but as a man who'd chosen his path deliberately. By afternoon he reached his cabin. It stood as he'd left it, solid and simple against the mountain backdrop. The eagle was there, perched in its usual tree, watching with fierce, intelligent eyes. Elias unpacked his supplies, started a fire in the stone fireplace. He placed the founder's medal on the small shelf beside his other war medals, not hidden away, but displayed, acknowledged. He opened his leather journal to a fresh page and wrote, October 1887, truth spoken, justice served, a community saved. And in the process, I discovered that the poor mountain man they mocked was richer than any of them in the ways that truly matter. He closed the journal and looked out at the vast mountain vista beyond his window. The town was visible far below, small but permanent. His town. Connected to him now, not by proximity but by something deeper, by shared history, acknowledged truth, and the bonds of a community that had learned to value honor over wealth. They had invited him to mock him. Instead, his arrival had changed everything. Changed them, changed the town, changed even himself. And as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Elias Crow sat by his fire, alone but not lonely, poor but not impoverished, silent but no longer voiceless, and was content.